Welcome to the second edition of the conversation on retreat. And we've been talking about retreat in the context of coastal areas, but with climate change accelerating, it could be for several other circumstances. This is the Friday afternoon talk of ORF Kolkata. So I start with a word of gratitude for our director, Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, who has encouraged us to use this platform of the Friday afternoon talk to take the conversation forward on strategic and managed retreat. For those who are in coastal areas, especially less densely populated and less urbanized, this is going to be a challenge, and increasingly so because of intensifying storms and rising sea levels. Today, we are very privileged and fortunate to have two very senior people joining us, Mark from Australia, Shikha from India. Mark is a specialist in coastal engineering and management, coastal risk assessment and adaptation, and technology development. He has over 30 years of technical and advisory experience, besides executive experience in internationally recognized science and research institutions. Mark also holds non-executive directorship with Reef Check Australia, Green Cross Australia. And like many Australians, Mark is an accomplished yacht racing sailor and also an instructor. Shikha has more than 40 years of experience as a journalist, as a columnist, as an editor. The Times of India Kolkata edition was launched under her editorship. She has a wide range of interests. In fact, she has been engaged with this conversation on retreat in this part of the country, in this part of the subcontinent, for about 10 years now, ever since the conversation was initiated by WWF in the context of the Sundarbans Delta region. So without much further ado, I will now invite Mark to speak for about 35 minutes. Mark, I'll give you a warning in about a couple of minutes in advance of your 35 minutes time slot. Then I will invite Shikha to comment on and make observations on the issue. Time permitting, we will take some questions on the subject from all those of you who have joined. And all of you are free to post your comments under the chat box. If you have questions, please put them under the Q&A box. Thank you once again for all of you who have taken time to join this important conversation. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. So I'm assuming everybody can hear me. I will just say that a lot of my international colleagues sometimes struggle. They tell me I have a strong Australian accent. Of course, I don't believe that I have a strong accent, but my colleagues do. So if you're having trouble hearing me, just maybe give me a holler. The second thing I'd probably say is that I've been working from home now. My office is actually 1,000 kilometres away from where I live, and I've been working at home since February, March, I guess, of this year. And it's interesting. I actually have a little office in my house, but over that time, one of my daughters has moved back home and kicked me into what is effectively the closet or the scullery. So it's a bit crazy around here. And I think there's some animals behind me as well. Anyway, let's get going. So I was fortunate enough to be brought up in a very, probably, I don't know, maybe a privileged Australian life, a coastal lifestyle. You know, for me and my family, my friends, enjoying the beach and the coastal environment and surfing and sailing, all that sort of. It's just a way of life for us. and so when we see these threats, for example, from anthropogenic climate change mediated through storms and all that sort of stuff, it's obviously of great concern to us because we have a lot of assets, a lot of infrastructure in Australia that is built on around the water, and it's incredibly valuable. The coastal environment, the coastal region to us is such at the core of our lifestyle. It is incredibly valuable to us. So we have to take these sorts of threats obviously very seriously. So I guess that's a bit of a context. So where I'll really start is I'll just quickly introduce the typology, the sea level rise typology that the IPCC commonly uses. And I'm assuming everybody's familiar with this, and that's this typology around, in terms of the adaptation to sea level rise in particular, is this idea that you can protect from it, you can retreat from it, and you can accommodate to it. Now, having said that, I know a lot of my colleagues around the world, particularly, for example, in the States, aren't particularly familiar with that typology. They don't necessarily use that typology. So I'm very aware that it's not universal, but it is quite common, and something which I will mention a little bit later. That's what we call a functional typology. So it's a kind of an action-based, kind of typology, and it suffers from a lack of awareness of social processes, particularly political processes, which is what we'll talk about. So just going back, so protecting against sea level rise, most people understand it's seawalls. There are obviously green alternatives to that. A colleague of mine has a really interesting saying around sea level rises, which around sea walls, which goes, I can't remember what the question is, but the answer is a seawall. Just because a lot of our local governments and a lot of our communities, when faced with this problem, they listen to some of the options and then just say, "Oh, we're just going to build a seawall." There's a strong view around that, obviously, particularly from the engineering community. But increasingly, a lot of our local communities don't like seawalls. Seawalls are obviously not infallible, as we learned from Fukushima and lots of other places. There's a number of hurricanes, obviously, in the southern states of the US, Katrina being a notable one, where the levees were overtopped. So that's, in many cases around the world, seawalls are becoming less and less palatable. Retreat, a lot of my colleagues often, say the only answer is to retreat. And clearly retreat is all about, you manage your problem by moving, by de-risking it, by moving everybody away, so it's not a problem anymore. So it's a once-off, simple, kind of elegant solution. But as a lot of the sort of research that I've been doing is, it's almost impossible to implement, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The third one, which is the accommodate or manage option, is a really interesting one, because in Australia, when we write sort of advice and reports to local government and communities, nobody really understands what that means, we find, or few people really understand. Yet I believe that accommodating sea level rise is actually going to be the major response throughout the world, actually. And there's a whole lot of political reasons, and a lot of work that's done in, for example, the Netherlands. This idea of living with water is all about managing it. It's not about retreat. There's a part of it around protection. As you're well aware, a lot of those low-lying countries have always had the dikes. A lot of those nations are now stopping to raise dikes substantially and are going down this living with water approach. So I actually believe around the world we'll see a lot more of that, although in my country and a lot of other nations I've worked in, it's not really well understood. And I'll just have a quick aside there. We're seeing this sort of response in a lot of the disturbances that we're seeing. So, for example, where I live in Australia, over the last decade, we've had major flood events, we've had major bushfire events, we've had the GFC, we've had a collapse of a lot of our industry sectors around mining, and now we've had COVID. We've had 6 major, very, very major disruptions to our communities over the last decade. And a lot of what we hear, this is in a globally connected society, we're just going to have more and more of this. So if you take, for example, COVID, which we're obviously all living with, if you take that same typology of protect, accommodate, or retreat, well, nobody can retreat. Or what does that mean? Go to Antarctica. I mean, in a globalized, connected world, nobody can retreat for very long. I mean, you know, New Zealand's cut off from the world at the moment, but it can't stay like that. So retreat is actually off the table for COVID response. The protect option, which everybody's been hoping for, is obviously through a vaccination. But as you hear increasingly from the WHO, it's like, well, maybe the vaccination is going to take longer than what we thought, and maybe it's not going to be as effective as what we thought, and the rollout will take longer. So that protect option is being, in my interpretation, being watered down. And what we're starting to hear from the WHO and other organisations is a treatment option. Whereas how can we live with COVID? How, if people get COVID, how can we treat them in a way that perhaps keeps them out of ventilators, out of intensive care units and that sort of stuff. So this, in our globally interconnected world where we're going to have a lot more disturbances going forward, if you use that typology, I believe that more and more we're going to go down this accommodating, adapting, trying to manage with it rather than retreating from it or protecting against it. That's just a speculation of mine. And I said, with climate change, you know, in a global sense of climate change, obviously the way to solve it is to reduce global emissions. We've been trying to do that as a global community for a long time. I mean, my early career was in climate change in the Australian government, and you know, we were advocating this 30 years ago when I started my career, and we're still not getting a lot of traction, what most people argue. So that idea of protecting against climate change by removing the risk, removing the threat, which is global emissions, we're just really struggling to do. And again, retreating from it is very, very difficult. So we're back into this accommodate or manage. Okay, so that's just a bit of my personal view, and I'm more than happy to discuss that questions. Okay, so let's go back now to the retreat. So again, early in the days of climate adaptation, when I started writing sort of reports for local government around this, probably 20 years ago now, a bit more. Retreat, my research and academic colleagues, was all about retreat. Retreat, you know, we were quite shocked in those early days that a lot of the communities and local governments that we presented these reports to, some of them actually said, we'll not accept your report unless you take the word retreat out of the report. We will not accept a retreat as an option. And, you know, as a bunch of researchers, we were sort of, you know, why not? It's the obvious thing to do. You move everybody to high ground. And in Australia, we have had some examples of that, very small examples of that. Following major events, we have relocated small communities of people immediately following major flood events. But these communities refused to have retreat as a viable option in a adaptation plan, community plan, regional government plan. And that was quite shocking. That's kind of what led to a lot of thinking that I've been doing over the last sort of decade around why this is. And the reason is that typology is not a politically informed typology. And so I live in you know, a democratic country with very strong property rights around property and real estate. So, and recognizing that not all nations are like this, but in nations that do have very strong property rights and democratic governments, these governments in general are very unwilling, and this is well known to political scientists, are very unwilling to impose on private property rights, because private property rights are just absolutely core to the capitalist democratic processes in these countries. And so that alone creates problems. Now, in nations with this sort of governance arrangements, if you do want to impose on such property rights, it inevitably involves compensation. And then as soon as you go into compensation, you create what's called a moral hazard. So what that basically means is that I live a kilometre from the ocean, but I live on top of a hill. Now, if you ask me as a taxpayer, as a ratepayer, to compensate my friends who are at risk on the waterfront here, although they deliberately chose to live in a location at risk, my answer is, you're dreaming. Why should I do that? And that's sort of a typical sort of response. And so if you allow this compensation to occur, you actually incentivize people to live there and stay there, because there's always got this compensation, coming as a backup. And the other thing that we found in, again, in countries like Australia, is that people are often happy to live in locations at risk because they believe they have private insurance coverage. So in Australia, the government has a stated policy of not being what we call the insurer of last resort. So if a natural disaster occurs, the Australian government will not compensate for damage to private property. There's emergency help, but it will not cover compensation. But people think that they have private insurance coverage that will compensate them in repeated events. Yet what they don't realise is that private insurers around the world, they what we call annualise the policy. So you have to renegotiate your policy every year. That's a pretty standard around many countries in the world, which means that the insurance company has at any time can withdraw your coverage. We've found that in Australia, Northern Australia, where we've had a lot of flooding issues over the last decade, where the insurance companies will actually not offer insurance coverage. So this has been a sort of a major change there. But so despite all that, there's a lot of perceptions around the community. So the communities that are vulnerable, they don't understand that vulnerable. We know from lots of work with the communities that most people don't understand what a 1 in 100 event means. So that, we had a major flood here in 2011, and we surveyed a lot of the residents who were flooded after that. And a lot of them said, well, we've only just moved in. The next flood's going to be 99 years away, so we're okay. So it's just a very big misunderstanding of what that means. They thought they had ongoing insurance coverage. They thought that the government would bail them out. So asking these people to relocate when they themselves thought that they had all these safety nets in the form of insurance, the next flood's not for a long time away. They thought the government might help them out. And so when these events do happen, there is a lot of surprise. And interesting enough, governments have a very small window of opportunity to implement relocation scenarios, policies, immediately after a major flood event. So in Australia, when we have had small opportunities, small communities that have been able to relocate with government help, but it only happens literally within weeks after a major event has happened. That's what we call reactive retreat. However, you cannot write that into, it's politically unpalatable to write that sort of process into a climate adaptation plan or community development plan. So we find that our government colleagues, our policymakers, just will not write in a policy plan that says, or management plan that says, in the event of this, we will incentivize retreat, because again, there's all sorts of moral hazards that come in there. There's also implications about compensation. Rather, what we find the local governments do, they sort of keep it as a last option in their back pocket to be used after event, but it's very rarely used. So really the social understanding and the political understanding around retreat presents a lot of barriers to it. The other thing that we find local governments do in a lot of locations around the world is that they use, for example, storms and flooding events as, I guess, kind of like an act of God, a force majeure claim, and what we call an act of God. So there's no blame, nobody could foresee this. We can't believe this has happened. This is not our fault. Which gives the local communities, local governments an out for not implementing, for example, coastal retreat policies. Yet the science tells us that these events are going to be more frequent. Yet we find that the political cycle is basically, they sort of hope that an event won't necessarily happen while they're sitting in the governance seat, or if it does, in fact, it's an opportunity for them to get more political capital, because they can be strong and say, oh, this act of God's come out of nowhere, this major flood, it's terrible, I'm the strong leader that's going to, help us through this. When in reality, we look back and say, hey, it's very likely that such an event was going to occur over this decade. You could have planned for it. You could have enacted, for example, coastal retreat policies. But because of those political barriers, it's just easy not to, because there's actually a lot of political capital to be gained during those events. So kind of in a nutshell, but when you put this sort of the social and the political overlay on top of this, it all starts to make sense to you. And this is a kind of the epiphany that myself and some of my colleagues had when we looked at the literature that was out there recommending retreat and these other similar sorts of policy options. And then we looked at why they're very rarely implemented. A lot of my colleagues were saying things like, oh, stupid government, they don't know what they're doing, why aren't they doing this? But when we actually sat down with some political scientists and worked through how the community and the political leaders are incentivized and what they look at, it all makes sense. As I said, from the political perspective, they don't want to, there's opportunities when these events happen for political capital. They don't want to impact on private property rights in advance of these because it would be unpopular to them in the sense of votes. The communities thought they had these protection mechanisms. The individual homeowners at risk thought they had these protection mechanisms, and the fact that humans are not very good at predicting these low frequency events. They thought they were covered by insurance. They thought that the governments might bail them out at some stage. And one of the other things that we found in Australia, which was interesting, is that over recent decades, the average time that somebody lives in the same house is about 13 years at the moment. So on average, most houses turn over in a decade and a half. So if you think about the frequency of major events, major flood events, it's about 20 to 30 years in Australia. So that there's not that many people in Australia, in the house they're living in now, they haven't experienced an event. So most of the people in the houses that are at risk have not experienced a major event, although the likelihood that they will experience a major event while they're in their house is something like 50%, actually, a lot of them, but a lot of them just haven't experienced that event. And what we find is some people, after they do experience an event and they find out that they're not covered by insurance, the government won't bail them out, they actually move. They don't relocate themselves, they just sell up and they move to another house, and the new owners come in with this mind of the next event's a long way away, I've got insurance coverage, the government will bail me out, all these sorts of things. So when you unpack and unravel the incentives that the individual homeowners, the incentives that the politicians and our local government bureaucrats have around them, and this is not blaming anybody, this is just the incentive that they are operating under and the conditions they're operating under, you suddenly see all these barriers to coastal retreat, and it explains, in this sort of governance system where I work in, why this happens. Now, that, as I said before, that recognises that not every nation has the same sort of governance system. So in obviously some nations, and I'm thinking perhaps of China here, actually has a lot more ability to implement coastal retreat, just the way the governance arrangements work there. And a good example of that is when the Three Gorges Dam was built around a decade ago. The Chinese government was able to relocate tens of thousands of residents. Now, I'm sure if you ask some of them, they weren't happy about that, but they were in locations that were going to be underwater or at risk, and they're not. So depending on the kind of institutional arrangements and governance arrangements and political arrangements that you have in your country, implementing coastal retreat can be easier or less easier, and that's obviously very, very context dependent. But the other thing, the final point I will make in my last couple of minutes is we also do a lot of work in small Pacific Island nations, and obviously some of these nations are, they're only a metre or two above mean sea level, and clearly going to be having a lot more inundation problems over coming decades. And it's one where you would just expect large-scale retreat to occur. Whole communities thinking about leaving islands and moving to other islands or other places, and we actually just don't see a lot of it. You see there's some sort of famous examples of islands that are now, when you fly over them, it's just a bunch of buildings almost growing out of a sea, actually, because a lot of the communities have chosen just to stay there and accommodate the rising waters. And you see buildings going up so the water can come underneath them, all sorts of management accommodation mechanisms, rather than large-scale retreat, actually. And I think that's been quite surprising to a lot of people as well. How am I going for time there? I think I've probably got another couple of minutes.
Yeah, you're doing fine.
Yep.
You still have about 10 minutes. So that,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's basically a summary of a work my colleagues and I have been doing almost in actually. I guess over the last decade. It's I have to say it has been a bit of an uphill battle for us with some of our colleagues. And one of the reasons for that, I guess, as a scientist, I'm originally an engineer and a mathematician and an oceanographer. So a lot of my sort of colleagues, we're delved in our own disciplines and in our own areas of science, and we see the world through a particular lens, which is how we've been trained, particularly around our discipline. And it was only when we really stepped outside that discipline and started really getting the insights from, for example, social scientists and political scientists, that we started to make sense of everything. And that, to me, actually happened fairly late in my 50s now. That actually happened fairly late in my career, I guess. So one of the things that really been espousing to a lot of our up and coming researchers, with engineers and oceanographers and sort of climate change scientists, is that a lot of it sort of obvious things that you might think around climate adaptation just simply aren't going to work. Even with mitigation, as I said in my early career when I worked for CSIRO, the Australian government, when we first started to look at this climate change thing, we were begging the Australian community and the Australian government to reduce emissions, and we still are. But and we were flabbergasted why we got almost no traction on this for decades. And it was only when we really kind of understood a bit more about the social sciences that we really sort of started to understand and make sense of why things are so slow, and why a lot of reports that things in the adaptation strategies that we'd written down, reports, we went to policymakers. The policymakers almost laughed at us. They just said, well, that's, what world are you living in? Just completely, because we had such a lack of understanding of the world that they lived in and the incentives around them and what they were trying to achieve. And, we were just completely naive about that. And so we were writing this stuff that just made complete functional sense to us, but was effectively unable to be implemented because we were operating in our own little bubble. And we just weren't kind of living in I guess what you might say is a real world of governance and politics and communities and all the rest of it. So that for me was a real lesson for me in my career. And I guess, I've been trying to bring some of my colleagues and the younger students coming along on that journey, but it is very hard. particularly for my peers, you know, it is a very difficult, a very difficult journey, actually. Yeah, so that's probably about all I have to say. I mean, I can talk about this forever, but that's not a bad segue to actually hand over, actually.
Thank you, Mark. You actually brought up to me three very important points, given the fact that the realities in coastal Australia may be somewhat different, say, from coastal South Asia. But nevertheless, you know, you talk about moral hazards. That's, to me, is something very important. And, you know, increasingly, administrations will have to respond to that. You know, you can't have one set of people paying taxes and others choosing to lead risky lives.
Indeed.
Yeah, that also brings the question of insurability. Over a period of time, maybe certain sectors, certain areas would fall out of insurance coverage, or may become extremely expensive, prohibitively expensive to buy coverage. And the third is, you know, you talked about people moving out and somebody else buying it, given that the average time span an Australian spends is about 13 years, which of course is not the same thing here. But I think that brings in a very important question of having legislations in place to debar people from occupying spaces or for putting such properties on sale. So on that note, I will now welcome Shika to make her comments. And if you could also address the three issues that Mark brought out. But it's up to you. Thank you. Over to you, Shika.
Thank you, Anurag. It was wonderful hearing what Mark had to say, which, you know, as a journalist, as a student of politics, when I was a student, what it really boils down to is how choices are made, and based on those choices, how decisions are made. And these are extremely, extremely complex negotiations which happen within when an individual confronts a situation, as well as when governments, local governments and communities have to deal with. Basically, what Mark was talking about and what you are also talking about is choices, and how choices have to be made, A, by individuals, B, by government, and B, by local communities. Making choices is one of the most difficult things that that have to be negotiated, keeping in mind a large number of variables, and each individual or each community or each segment within a community tends to make a set of choices based on a certain perception of what Mark was talking about, which is the risks of living in vulnerable areas, the risk of climate change itself, and sea level rise, and how they understand that vis-a-vis their own locations, their own circumstances, their own lives. So having said that, I would really think that one of the, I was reading your paper, Mark, and that's where I really thought that you have sort of put your finger on the problem, which is that there is a strategy for coastal adaptation, including retreat, which could be just in time, preemptive, or as a reaction. You were talking about reactions in Australia, but more than that is what you're talking about is that policymakers, communities, and individuals seem to be looking at how to manage, and that's the choice that they're making, how to manage a natural disaster and their understanding of what should be what is a natural disaster. And if it's low frequency, as you said, once in 100 years in technical terms, but every so often in terms of the individual or a community, then these choices get, then instead of making what would seem to experts to be a rational choice, people tend to end up making what seems to be apparently irrational choices. And therefore, the politicians or the political systems are faced with an impossible negotiation of how to balance the different rationalities of different segments of interest. And I'm calling them interest because really they have different reasons for making the choices that they make. Therefore, the process of decision making is extremely complicated, as is quite obvious. Because decision making is so complex by itself, and in these particular circumstances, it's even more difficult. Political risk is something that, or how a political establishment responds to it. You're right, there is at bottom the idea of how strongly in favor of protecting property rights is a political system. In Australia, the protection of property as a right is very strong. In India, on paper, it is equally strong. But it is in the way in which it works out in practice. And then there are further issues, and I think here I would like to sort of contextualize it in the South Asia, especially the Bay of Bengal area context, where the right to property is very strong on paper. The right to property in practice is complicated by social and family claims, which can be contradictory. And then there is the other problem which we all understand, especially in the case of a coastal, very, very vulnerable coastal area like the Sundarbans, is that the title to property is not clear. There are tens and thousands of people who are living in that area without clear title to property. It is a managed illegality, as it were. And because this is a managed illegality, how do you come up with a policy which covers the legally owned, somebody's legal right to property, and therefore, how do you compensate it? How do you insure it? How do you get them to move back from it? How do you incentivize the retreat? Whether it is just in time, preemptive, or reactionary, it doesn't matter. But how do you negotiate that? And then you have a much larger number of people who are equally impacted by the events. And then you find that they have no legal titles, no rights, as it were. So the situation is extremely complex. The political barriers, therefore, are, as you very rightly pointed out, political barriers are, in any case, they appear to be insurmountable, even where rights and the paperwork matches. In areas like India, where large segments of the population live without clear title to properties, there the problem becomes even more difficult to even more difficult to find a solution. The solution is very, and here I will get down to brass tacks. I mean, what has happened? People who can afford not to live in the most vulnerable areas have made a choice and a decision and have invested behind that area, at the back of the area, so they're safe. They have protected their properties, they have protected their ownership, they've protected themselves. Those who are vulnerable continue to live exactly where they were. But this being India with very large concentrations of population and people who are always hungry for land and a little bit of space, they have moved into the areas left vacant, or they have taken them on as tenants. So, you know, there are so many complexities which come along with each of the choices that are being made, which makes it very difficult for any kind of legislation. Now, in India, our experience with legislation, you talked about the Three Gorges Dam in China. Let me talk about Sardar Sarovar Dam in India, where we, you know what happened. We told the people, you move out, you get compensation. They took the compensation, they didn't move out, and then there are endless difficulties because how in a land-stressed country do you find alternative spaces which are exactly the same as the spaces that you vacated? So these are all the political barriers that come in. Incentivizing it, finding a strategy of incentives to get people to move back is, I think, something that on paper can be written up as a beautiful plan. There is no problem there. But what is likely to happen is that in writing up that plan or drafting out that policy, which are really low risk options. The writing part of it is the low risk option. There is the other problem with all such plans and policies, which is that no one is asking the host populations or the alternative sites how they would welcome the infusion of such large numbers of people. And how do you recreate networks of social safety that obviously exist to help people live through their vulnerabilities? That is an irreplaceable, and how do you put a value on it? Therefore, an incentive system that fails to put a value on the kind of social, the community safety nets, their sense of security, the kind of support they gave each other, and then look at where they come in and resettle, is something that I think will require far more complex planning, a far greater, and we need to sit down perhaps and look at what choices actually, how choices are made, and the kind of rationalities that go into the making of choices before either a plan or a policy can be drafted, which sort of takes into account a combination of, well, in India, we will always use coercion, which is, okay, here is what it is, here is the plan, here's what we're going to do. If you don't agree, we'll coerce you into it. But having coerced the person, you still have a resentful, resistant population. And the other problem, which is really very, it's somewhere between politics and administration, and nobody is going to touch that place. How do you regulate how do you regulate other people from entering into the spaces that have been vacated?
Exactly.
That is, so therefore I think basically I'll go back to what I started with, which is how do you map the making of choices, and how are these decisions arrived at? Unless we have a better understanding of it, till that time, the social and political interests, cross-cutting interests, are not going to be taken into account, and therefore finding a realistic, implementable plan or a policy which is long-term rather than, you've used a lovely little phrase in your paper, plan and forget, the plan and forget approach.
Yeah.
We could either go for the plan and forget approach, or if we actually want to do it, then we'll have to do a far deeper dive into how choices are made and how these decisions can be negotiated. Anurag, I think that I'll just sort of leave it at that.
Thank you. It was a fantastic review of Mark's paper. Besides your own observations of the situation, particularly for us, where coercion is a large component, even if on paper we like to operate as democracies do. We have a very good question from Nilanjan, and I'll just read it out for your benefit. What might be the incentives for political decision makers or politicians to act in favor of managed and strategic retreat? Mark, you pointed out that it is not in the interest of the political actors to back something or to legislate something that that kind of dissipates their constituency. Basically, if I am an elected politician and I cannot be seen asking my constituents to go elsewhere, I have no interest in doing so. So Nilanjan's question is precisely what could possibly be the interests of the political class in promoting, knowing that places like Australia and the US and Canada might have a lot of space to retreat, but as Shika was pointing out, that more densely populated areas and not necessarily urban will have that challenge. So anything that comes to your mind as a response, I think would be a great response.
Yeah, so I mean, Shika was exactly right. I mean, all the, to me, the body of research that's been done around this assumes that there's no people in the system. It's just a bunch of buildings and houses that you have to protect or move. The whole people social side of it is largely been completely missing. And, we're starting to see it now, and that, 100% agreement. Now in Australia, what happens is that, so the sea levels are rising, but the actual, what happens is the flood events happen at different times in different areas. So one part of Australia will have a big flood event, which is made worse through climate change, and then a few years later it'll be somewhere else. So it's still treated like a very unusual event. We'll try and get through it, and everybody will forget about it, and rah-de-rah-de-rah, and then it's largely. And in Australia, we have this slightly, I think maybe slightly different than India, but in Australia, what's happened over the last decades is or maybe same in India, but a lot of the most vulnerable houses in Australia are still very high value, owned by wealthy people. There's still, that's just the situation it is. And with local governments in Australia, the way local governments are set up is that local governments, we're all taxed, we all pay tax. That tax in Australia goes to the federal government, it's a federation, and little of that tax comes back to the local government. So local governments, the revenue from local governments comes from land taxes. So the more high value properties are in a local community, the more revenue to the local government. right? So there is, and the high value in coastal communities of Australia, the high value, the generating, revenue generating properties in Australia for local councils are the ones right on the coast, and they're also the ones most at risk. So local governments don't want to see retreat also because they're losing their revenue, actually. So that's a major issue. But I think the only way we're going to, in Australia, and countries like America, the only way we're going to see any real political incentives is when the problem gets so large, so you have frequent repeated events at the same location that the community, you just can't ignore it. If it's just one event that happens once every 20 years or something, it disappears in the memory because we've got that 13-year turnover. It just disappears in the memory. I think the only way in a country like Australia or America or the UK and a lot of Western Europe, you get an event, unless you're in somewhere like the Netherlands that's just living underwater below the sea level, is that if you have a whole lot of repeated events occurring in such a frequency that it's that it gets into headlines and stays into the headlines. It doesn't disappear after a couple of weeks as the next new event comes along. For a lot of those sorts of countries, I think that's the only way we're going to get any real traction, to be honest.
Thank you. I will direct the next question for Shikha Mukherjee. There is this question which says, is it possible for a place like the Sundarbans, where property rights are rather grey, as you said, to pay for managed retreat? I mean, how do you pay to people? As you said, it is a managed illegality. And then, what's the way out? And before you get started, let me put another question that's come from Professor Sugata Hajra, and to both of you. Professor Hajra, by the way, Mark, is also an oceanographer, and he's been working in the Bay of Bengal area for close to 30 years now, maybe more. He says, can depopulation of vulnerable coastal segments and regeneration of natural vegetation be considered equivalent to a development project? If it can be termed as a development project, then possibly there is a possibility of compensating the people who are vacating that space. Yeah, but before you take this question, I would like you to remind you of the question of the people who have very tenuous or non-existent property rights. Shikha.
This is a problem with which we are even now at this sorry. This is a problem of not tenuous, but no actual legal claims on the land on which they live, other than an oral contract, which could be one of the ways in which these settlements are negotiated. The problem really is, Anurag, and I'm answering both questions together, Shugata's as well as the other question you asked. I'm answering the two together. A development project is a government program, and therefore it will deal with what are legal claims. It will deal with people who have a legal claim to that particular plot of land. Now, I do know, and I will refer Shugata to this, is that in the case of the small card project in Shingur in West Bengal, completely different location, there, finding people with the people who were living on the land, cultivating it and making a livelihood from the land, were not the people who owned it. Therefore, the compensation would obviously go to the owner of the land. How do you compensate the man who gets left out? That's number one. How do you compensate a man who is living on that property by paying rent. In other words, he's a tenant and that's an oral tenancy. So with all these complications, creating a development program or a development project, which would then have to rewrite all kinds of laws on property and ownership and title and claims and tenancy, which would impact a far larger community of people other than the people in Sundarbans. You can't write laws which are so narrow. You have to write laws which are universal in application. Therefore, it's a kind of nightmare situation to try and work that into a development project. However, it can be done provided there is a political investment made in getting everyone to agree that this is the only choice and this is the rational choice. The only choice and the rational choice. Now that would mean bringing in not just the communities or the individuals or the interests, various segments of interest who are located in that vulnerable area, but it would mean bringing in every political actor of every persuasion onto the same page. I think rationally speaking, that is quite difficult, but it's not impossible. I think the process would therefore have to start at the political end rather than on the planning and policy making end. And I think that is exactly the kind of answer which I would tend to give to the first question that you asked. How do you deal with these illegalities? The only way to deal with these illegalities is if collectively, not just the people of the Sundarban area who are living, whose legal title to the places that they're living and cultivating is gray, but it would require that this exception which was going to be made in the case of Sundarbans is not extended across the whole state, and somebody doesn't go and file a case in the High Court and it's all gone. It's all gone, because then everything would get stuck and there would be no solution. So really, I think the kind of the direction in which Mark pointed us, which is that living with water, given the kind of situation that we have in the Sundarbans now, living with water by creating a kind of protection against the worst impact of a natural disaster is perhaps at this point in time the more practical response, because at whatever happens, however long this other process takes, first and foremost, the other process hasn't started off. Nobody's even started talking about it, except in academic circles maybe. But that apart, there has been no political discourse launched on this, number one. Number two, these things take time. What happens to that population which remains vulnerable and then every year takes this huge financial hit every time there's a storm? It doesn't have to be on the scale of Umphan or on the scale of Sidr or any of those. It has to be the normal storms which happen and inundate their fields. Some part of the Sundarbans always gets badly impacted, negatively impacted. So what is a political choice that we have here? One, working out something which is very long-term and will take time and a lot of political investment, provided the political class wishes to make that political investment. And the second is the immediate need to provide some kind of protection to large vulnerable populations, because that is the responsibility of the political establishment or the political system, as it were, because that is the job of government. And government cannot sort of postpone a decision on this forever.
Thank you. Mark, do you have a last comment? We are running out of time. I think we've about run out of time. If you have a last comment, you're most welcome to do so. Mark.
Yeah, look, I think, you know, this is a problem that's not going to go away. There are millions of people, and I think we have to, exactly as we've just heard, we have to get real about, you know, these kind of naive ideas that we can just simply move into very large communities to another place sort of seamlessly. Is we've just got to come to, you know, it's just a big dream that's not likely to occur without a whole lot of effort. And even then, I think, to me, we just need to get real about that and really understand. And for my research community, is stop putting forward, you know, proposals that are just clearly unrealistic, and focus more on the more politically informed, socially informed types of opportunities that are actually implementable. That's, you know, that would be my sort of recommendation.
Thank you very much. In fact, hearing both of you out on your last comments in particular actually gives me the idea for the third edition of the conversation, as and when we are able to take it, given the fact that Mark very clearly says that this is a naive idea and rather unrealistic. And Shika mentioned that we haven't yet started a conversation on a political level, knowing fully well that we need to start at the political end rather than the implementation and planning end. So the idea that I'm getting for the third, you know, iteration conversation is probably organic movement of people, you know, rather than trying to move the entire community. Possibly it is, you know, giving them the choice of making options available to them and exercising the choice. So with that, I think I will close it here. We are beyond our time. Mark and Chika, thank you very much for taking time to deliberate. And all those who have joined, at one point we had 49 people who had logged in. So thank you each and every one. Thank you to those who posed questions. There are a few that I could not take and ask the panelists to address. So my apologies to those to whom I could not do justice. Thank you once again, and hope to see you again sometime soon. Bye-bye, stay well.